The Presumed Dead Journalist. Uncovering the truth before it's too late. Hook. What happens when a journalist is presumed dead, but she's still alive and being hunted? In this chilling thriller, Elena is forced to trust the unlikeliest allies as she races against time to expose a deadly conspiracy, where every move she makes could be her last. Will she survive the hunt? Who can she trust when everyone around her is a suspect? Stick around to the end. Things are about to get dark, and you won't see this twist coming. The newsroom was silent, save for the occasional tapping of keys and the low hum of fluorescent lights. Elena sat at her desk, staring at the glowing screen in front of her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. A new assignment flashed on the monitor. It was about the disappearance of a journalist, one she knew too well. David Grant, the presumed dead journalist. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her mind raced back to their last conversation months ago. The days when they were colleagues before he went off the grid. Before the rumors started, everyone said he was dead, but Elena never believed it. She couldn't. She shook her head, trying to push away the gnawing feeling. Her instincts told her something was wrong. Something was hidden beneath the surface. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. The screen displayed a single sentence. Asterisk, you were right about him. Asterisk. Elena's heart skipped. She felt her pulse quicken. Who could it be? She hesitated, then typed back. Asterisk, what do you mean? Asterisk. The response came immediately. Asterisk, meet me where it all began. Midnight. Asterisk. A chill ran down her spine. The words felt too real, too urgent. She couldn't ignore it. She grabbed her coat, her hands trembling. The newsroom felt colder now, emptier. The streets outside were bathed in the glow of streetlights, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. She walked quickly, her breath visible in the crisp air. Every footstep echoed in the silence. The alley was darker than she remembered. It smelled of damp concrete and old garbage. A faint sound of something shifting in the distance made her stop. She looked around. Nothing. The message had been clear. Asterisk where it all began, asterisk. She walked deeper into the alley, the air thick with tension. A figure emerged from the shadows. Elena froze. It was him. David. Or was it? His eyes were wide, hollow, like he'd seen too much. He stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. Get out of here. It's not safe. Before she could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. The hair on her neck stood up. Someone was following them. She turned to run, but the figure in front of her vanished. Just like that. Gone. Her breath caught in her throat. Then she heard a familiar voice. It wasn't David. It was someone else. Don't trust him. The voice was cold, urgent. Elena spun around. There was no one there. Her heart hammered in her chest. The alley was empty. Too empty. The streetlights flickered above, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. She could feel her breath quickening, her chest tightening. The message lingered in her mind. Asterisk, don't trust him, asterisk. But who? David? Or the voice? She strained her ears, trying to pick up any sound, any movement. Nothing. Just the oppressive silence. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a new message. Asterisk, they're watching you. Asterisk. Her stomach dropped. Who is watching? She checked over her shoulder, the hairs on her neck prickling. The alley stretched on endlessly in both directions. Her instinct screamed for her to leave, but something kept her rooted to the spot. She couldn't turn back now. David had been involved in something dangerous, something he had never fully explained. Elena's mind raced through the fragments of information she had gathered over the years. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. The shadows shifted again. A figure stepped from the darkness, moving silently toward her. Her heart skipped a beat. This time, she didn't hesitate. She ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement, the sound echoing through the alley. But the figure was faster. Too fast. It was gaining on her. Closer. Closer. She stumbled, almost losing her balance. And then a hand gripped her wrist. She gasped, spinning around, her eyes wild with fear. David stood there, or what appeared to be David. His face was pale, his features gaunt. His breath came in shallow gasps. "Elena," he whispered, "you shouldn't have come." His voice trembled. "Why?" she managed to say, her voice cracking. He glanced over his shoulder as though expecting something or someone. "They'll know," he said. A sudden, sharp noise echoed from the darkness. A low, mechanical hum, like the sound of an engine starting. Her blood ran cold. She looked up. A black van rolled into view, its headlights blinding her. The doors slid open, and they were waiting. They had been waiting for her all along. Her feet pounded against the cold concrete floor, echoing in the empty hallway. She barely dared to breathe, her heart racing as adrenaline coursed through her veins. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit, with doors lining the walls like silent sentinels. She didn't know where she was. Her mind spun. She needed to find a way out, but each step seemed to take her deeper into this maze. Behind her, she could hear the sound of pursuit. Footsteps growing louder. The man in black was close. Too close. She pushed forward, her chest tight with every breath, but she refused to stop. The hallway forked ahead. She didn't think, just turned left, rushing down another corridor. Her fingers brushed the walls for any sign of a door, a window, anything. Nothing. She slammed into a locked door, her breath catching as she threw her weight against it. It didn't budge. No, no, no. A voice echoed in her mind. David's voice. Asterisk, it's bigger than you. Bigger than both of us, asterisk. She couldn't stop thinking about his words. What did they mean? Why hadn't he helped her? She had trusted him. The footsteps were closer now. She had to keep moving. Her mind was spinning, but her legs kept going, propelled by sheer instinct. At the end of the hallway, she saw a staircase leading down into darkness. Without thinking, she sprinted toward it, praying it would lead to something. Anything. She took the stairs 2 at a time, the creak of the steps echoing through the silence. The air grew colder the farther down she went, a chill that seeped into her bones. Her foot hit the last step with a thud. She stood still for a moment, listening. The footsteps above had stopped. She dared not breathe. Had they lost her? She crept forward, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The corridor below was even more sterile, more ominous than the upper floors. There were no windows, no signs of life, just the endless stretch of concrete. Her heart raced, each beat deafening in the stillness. Suddenly, she froze. A shadow moved at the far end of the hallway. She instinctively stepped back into the darkness, holding her breath. It was another figure, a man, but not the same as before. This one wore a gray suit, his face sharp, calculating. He stopped in front of a door, his hand reaching for the handle. The door opened with a soft click. He stepped inside. Elena's pulse quickened. Was this the way out? She hesitated. There was no time to waste. She darted forward, slipping through the crack of the door before it closed behind him. She was inside. A faint buzzing filled the air, accompanied by the hum of machinery. Her eyes scanned the room. It was large, metal walls, high-tech equipment everywhere. It looked like some kind of control center. Monitors lined the walls, showing various feeds, images of different locations, some of which were familiar. Her stomach twisted as she saw herself on one of the screens. The figures in black. David. They were all here, watching her. The man in the suit was at a console now, tapping rapidly at the keys. Elena's breath caught. What had she stumbled into? A door on the far side of the room opened. 2 more figures entered. They looked like the same men she had seen before. Dark suits, dark eyes. They didn't speak, just moved toward her. She backed up, but there was nowhere to go. Her mind raced for a way out, but it was too late. They had found her, the figures closed in, their movements precise, calculated. Elena's chest tightened as she backed into the cold metal wall. Her mind raced, but every possible escape route seemed blocked. The man in the gray suit glanced at the monitors, then back at her, his expression unreadable. "You're in the wrong place, Elena," he said quietly, his voice smooth but edged with menace. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "I don't know what's going on," she said, her voice shaking. "But you're not going to get away with this." The man didn't respond. Instead, he pressed a button on the console. The lights in the room flickered, and the sound of a heavy door sliding shut echoed through the space. Elena's breath quickened. She could feel the walls closing in. "We've been watching you," the man continued, stepping closer. "Since the beginning." The others behind him remained silent, their cold, emotionless eyes locked on her. "Watching." Elena's voice rose with disbelief. "What do you want from me?" He stepped even closer, now only a few feet away. "Your curiosity," he said. "It's what led you here. You couldn't let it go. Could you?" Elena's heart skipped. "David," she whispered, her eyes flickering to the monitors. "Where is he?" The man's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "David is no longer useful," he said. "Just like you." Her stomach dropped. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're lying. He's a tool," the man interrupted, his voice cold. "Just like the rest of you. We use people like you to get what we need." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mind struggled to comprehend what he was saying. Her pulse raced in her ears. "This is bigger than both of you," he said, almost mocking her earlier words. "And now that you've seen too much, you're a liability." The weight of his words sank in. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let them do whatever they were planning. Desperation surged within her. Her hands shook as she reached for the nearest object, a metal pipe on the table. Before the man could react, she swung it at him with every ounce of strength she had left. He staggered back, his hand swiping at the air. The others moved in, but Elena was already running. She darted toward the door, shoving one of the figures aside as she reached for the handle. It didn't budge. Locked. She turned, her mind racing for something, anything, to help her. The man in the gray suit regained his composure, his eyes flashing with irritation. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice colder now. With a surge of panic, Elena grabbed the nearest object and hurled it toward the monitors. The glass shattered. Sparks flew. Alarms blared, a shrill, deafening noise that made her ears ring. Chaos erupted. The figures scrambled, shouting orders, but Elena didn't wait. She bolted for the far corner of the room, finding another door hidden behind a stack of equipment. She yanked it open. A long, narrow hallway stretched out before her. Her feet flew against the floor, each step heavier than the last. The sound of pursuit followed her. She could feel them closing in again. There was no time to think, no time to look back. She ran faster, faster, until she slammed into something. A figure stood in her path. Her breath caught. David. But this time his eyes were different. Cold. Empty. "Elena," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She stopped, eyes wide. "You shouldn't have run," he murmured. Her heart raced. David's face was a mask of regret. "Elena," he repeated, "you don't know what you're up against. You'll never make it out." Before she could respond, the door behind her burst open. The men in black appeared again, closing in fast. David didn't move. He just stood there, watching, as the figures advanced toward her. Elena made her choice. She wasn't going down without a fight. She ran, shoving past him, her heart pounding with fear and fury. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let them win. Belena pushed past David, her hands shaking, but her resolve hardening. Her feet slammed against the floor, each step carrying her further from him, further from the cold emptiness in his eyes. She didn't dare look back. The men were closing in. She could hear them, their footsteps growing louder with each passing second. The hallway twisted and turned, but it all felt the same, dark, suffocating, like a maze with no exit. Her chest burned, her breath ragged, but she kept going. Ahead, a flicker of light, an open door. She burst through it, her pulse racing, and found herself in a storage room. Boxes stacked high, crates pushed to the side. She darted behind one of the crates, trying to catch her breath. The room was silent for a moment. Too silent. Her eyes darted around. Where were they? A shiver ran down her spine as she heard a faint sound, like footsteps. Then, the creak of the door. The figures were here. They were searching. She pressed herself flat against the wall, holding her breath, hoping they wouldn't find her. She could hear them now, muttering, footsteps scraping against the floor. Closer, closer. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Her fingers tightened around a metal rod she'd grabbed from the floor. It felt cold in her hand. If they find me... She didn't dare finish the thought. Suddenly, one of the men stopped, his voice cutting through the air. "She's here somewhere." The other responded, his voice low. "We don't have much time." The sound of more footsteps, this time moving faster. Elena's blood turned to ice. She had to act. She had to move before they were on top of her. Her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her ears. She slipped from behind the crate and crouched low, staying in the shadows. She could see the door, the hallway beyond. If she could just make it there. Her legs screamed for her to stop, but she pushed forward. Just as she reached the door, a voice rang out behind her. There, a figure appeared in the doorway. Elena froze. The man raised his hand, and for a split second, she saw the glint of a gun. Instinct kicked in. She flung herself through the door, slamming it shut behind her, but not before the sound of a shot echoed through the hallway. The bullet whizzed past her, grazing her arm, but she didn't stop. Pain exploded through her, but she pushed it aside, forcing her legs to move. She stumbled, clutching her arm, but she kept running. Ahead, the stairs led to an open door. Freedom. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the world spinning around her. Her thoughts were a blur. David, the men, the hallway. She couldn't think. She had to get out. She reached the door, her hand grabbing the handle. But the door slammed open. David stood there again, his eyes locked with hers, his face a mask of emptiness. "Elena, stop," he shouted. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed him aside and ran through the door. Into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap to the face, but it felt like freedom. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay there. She had to disappear. She had to escape. Behind her, the sound of footsteps grew fainter. The men in black. They were still coming. But for now, she was free. The cold night air cut through her as she ran, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She didn't stop to look behind her. Her legs burned. Her arm throbbed from the bullet graze, but the fear, the desperate need to escape, pushed her forward. The streets were deserted, empty, as if the world had forgotten about her. The only sound was the rapid pounding of her footsteps and her ragged breathing. She had no plan, no destination, just the raw instinct to survive. Her mind raced. Where could she go? Who could she trust? David's face flashed in her mind, empty, distant. Had he betrayed her? Was he one of them now? No, she couldn't afford to think about that. Not yet. A dark alley loomed ahead. Without thinking, she darted into it, hoping to lose any pursuers. The shadows swallowed her whole as she pressed herself against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. The alley was narrow, lined with dumpsters and debris. She could hear the faint sounds of distant traffic, but everything else was quiet. Too quiet. Then, a car pulled into the mouth of the alley. Her heart stopped. The headlights washed over the trash-strewn path, illuminating the space in front of her. She stepped back, holding her breath, praying they hadn't seen her. The car slowed as it entered the alley. Her pulse thudded in her ears. It stopped a few feet away. The engine cut off, and for a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door opened. A figure stepped out. Her breath caught. It was David. He stood still, staring into the alley, his face unreadable. For a moment, she wasn't sure whether to move or stay hidden. But something in her gut told her this was it. This was the moment that would change everything. She couldn't run anymore. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward into the light. David's eyes flickered to her, his expression unreadable. "Elena," he said, his voice low, "you shouldn't have run." Her heart raced. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you help me back there?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted to the shadows behind her, his eyes scanning the alley. "They're still looking for you," he said quietly. "They'll never stop." Elena's mind was a whirlwind. "I can't go back. I can't trust you." David's face hardened, but there was something else there, something faintly regretful, almost sorrowful. "I know, but you have no choice. They'll kill you if you keep running." Her breath caught. "Then help me," she demanded. "Help me stop them." He hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "I can't do it alone," he said, his voice low. "But we can do it together." Elena's eyes locked with his. For the first time since this nightmare began, she saw something in him. Something real. The briefest flicker of hope. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the alley. They were here. The men in black. They were closing in. David's eyes darkened. "Elena, get in the car. Now." Without waiting for her response, he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the car. She didn't hesitate. This might be the only chance she had left. The car door slammed shut behind her, and the engine roared to life. David sped down the alley, taking sharp turns, the tires screeching as they raced through the streets. The city blurred around them. Elena didn't know where they were going, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not until she uncovered the truth. The truth about David. The truth about the men in black. And the truth about herself. As the car disappeared into the night, Elena realized something. The fight was far from over. The car tore through the night, weaving between the empty streets. Elena pressed her back against the seat, her heart still racing. David's grip tightened on the wheel, his jaw clenched in concentration. The headlights sliced through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls around them. Elena's mind raced, her thoughts bouncing from one question to the next. Who were the men in black? What did David know? Why had he pushed her away in the warehouse, only to help her now? "What is this, David?" she finally asked, her voice strained. "Why are they after me? Why didn't you help me?" David's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice cold. "Then explain it to me." Elena shot back, her frustration boiling over. David's eyes flicked to her, his expression tense. "I can't explain everything right now," he said, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "But they're hunting you because you know too much. You've stumbled onto something bigger than both of us." Elena stared at him, trying to process his words. She had been investigating David's disappearance, his sudden return, the strange messages, everything. It had seemed like an ordinary case at first, but now it felt like she had walked into a nightmare. "You were part of it, weren't you?" she asked, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. David's jaw tightened. "I didn't choose this, Elena," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't have a choice." She swallowed hard. The car swerved, narrowly avoiding a parked truck. "Where are we going?" she demanded, her mind spinning. "What's your plan?" David didn't answer right away. He pushed the car faster, weaving through side streets, taking corners with alarming speed. Finally, he spoke. "There's a safe house," he said, his voice low. "It's the only place they won't find us right away." Elena frowned. "Who's they, David? Who are we running from?" David's eyes flicked to her, haunted. "They're not just men. They're a group, a network that goes beyond anything you can imagine." Elena felt a chill creep up her spine. "Who are they?" she repeated, her voice shaking now. David hesitated. "They call themselves the Collective. They control everything: information, people, governments, corporations. They're untouchable." A knot twisted in her stomach. "Are you part of them?" she whispered, barely able to get the words out. David's silence was the answer. She recoiled, feeling betrayed, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. "I had no choice," he said again, his voice quiet. "I was pulled into this years ago, and I thought I could get out, but they won't let me." Elena's mind was reeling. The Collective. What kind of power did they hold? And what did they want with her? Her head pounded as she tried to process everything, but there was no time to think. The car screeched to a halt in front of a dilapidated building. David turned to her, his eyes filled with urgency. "We're here. Get out." She didn't hesitate, scrambling from the car and following him into the building. The inside was dark, the walls covered in peeling paint. David led her down a narrow hallway, passing locked doors and windows covered in grime. At the end of the hallway, he paused, looking over his shoulder. "Stay close," he said, his voice strained. They reached a heavy steel door. David pressed a button on the wall next to it, and the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Elena stepped inside, feeling the weight of the walls close in around her. David locked the door behind them, his eyes scanning the space. "We'll be safe here for a while," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The door was solid, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't hold them for long. She turned to David. "What do we do now?" David didn't answer immediately. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something. "We need to find out how deep this goes. The Collective, they've got eyes everywhere. If they know you've escaped," he trailed off, his voice heavy with dread. "They'll come for me," Elena finished for him, her voice barely a whisper. David's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I never wanted this for you." Her mind was numb. None of this made sense. None of it. But one thing was clear. The fight had just begun. The silence between them stretched on, thick with tension. Elena felt the weight of David's words, but they didn't make her feel any safer. "I don't understand, David," she said, her voice strained. "Why me? Why are they after me?" David paced across the room, his hands clenched at his sides. "You're the key," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You found something you weren't supposed to. A piece of information, a connection that they didn't want exposed. And now," he paused, his eyes narrowing, "now, they'll stop at nothing to make sure it stays buried." Elena's head swam. She had always been curious, driven to find answers, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. "The Collective," she murmured. "Who are they really? What do they want with me?" David's gaze flickered to the small window at the far end of the room, but he didn't answer right away. Finally, he spoke, his voice distant. "They control everything, from the shadows. You wouldn't believe the things they've infiltrated. The governments, the media, corporations. They pull the strings from behind the scenes, keeping the world in check, controlling what you see and hear. It's all a game to them." Elena's stomach churned. "And me?" she asked, though she already had a sinking feeling about what the answer might be. "They believe you have something you've discovered, something that could expose them." "Expose them how?" David's lips tightened. "Remember when you first started investigating the missing journalists? You were looking for me, but you found a trail that led deeper. Deeper than you could have imagined. The people who've disappeared, the ones they've silenced." He paused, his eyes searching hers, haunted. "They weren't just journalists. They were a threat to the collective, a threat they couldn't risk." A chill ran down Elena's spine. Her hand instinctively went to her chest, where her own ID badge hung, the one she'd taken from the office of the journalist she had been investigating. It felt heavier now, more significant. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know I was looking for anything like this. I was just trying to find you, David. I wanted to understand what happened to you." David met her gaze. "And now you understand, don't you?" he said, his voice grim. "You're not just another missing journalist. You're caught in the web they've spun, and they won't let you go. Not without making sure you're silenced." Elena swallowed, her throat dry. "So, what do we do now?" David's eyes darkened. "We fight back." Elena blinked, surprised by the fierceness in his voice. "Fight back," she echoed. "How?" "We're on the run, David. They're everywhere." David's face hardened. "I know, but there's one thing they didn't count on." "What?" Elena asked, her heart pounding. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Us. They think they have control, that we're weak. But we're not." He turned away, moving to a table in the corner of the room. On it, Elena saw a laptop, its screen glowing faintly in the darkness. David opened it and typed quickly, his fingers flying over the keys. "What are you doing?" Elena asked, stepping closer. "I'm accessing their network," he said. "I'm going to find what they're hiding. And once we have that information, we can expose them. We can stop them." Elena stared at him, a mix of fear and hope rising within her. Could they really do this? Could they take down the collective? Her mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "This is insane," she muttered. "We're risking everything. Our lives. You heard what they're capable of." David's eyes met hers, his expression intense. "I know, but if we don't do this, they'll just keep controlling us. They'll keep destroying lives. It has to end, and it ends now." There was a fire in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. It was the same fire that had kept him going, even after everything he'd been through. And for the first time since she'd met him, Elena believed in the possibility of victory. David's hands moved over the keyboard, a faint smile curling at the corners of his mouth as he bypassed security measures. "We're getting close," he said, his voice barely audible. "Just a little longer." Elena stood by, her heart hammering, as the tension in the room thickened. They were on the verge of something dangerous, something life-altering, the truth. And if they found it, nothing would ever be the same again. But in that moment, Elena knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stop now. Not when they were this close. Not when the whole world was about to change. David's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his eyes scanning the screen, his breath shallow. Elena stood behind him, her gaze flicking nervously toward the door, then back to the laptop. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every second felt like it could be their last. David's hands moved again, typing faster now, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Just a few more seconds," he murmured, barely audible. Elena's pulse was racing. She couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were about to do. They weren't just accessing a system. They were about to expose a shadowy network that had been controlling everything, a network that had been hunting them both. Her mind raced. Was this even possible? Could they really take down the collective? Suddenly, David's fingers stopped. He looked up at the screen, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and triumph. "We've got it," he said, his voice hoarse. The files, everything we need. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She leaned in, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the list of documents unfolding before her. Names, codes, dates, files detailing everything the collective had been hiding. Corruption, manipulation, control. Elena felt a rush of vindication, but also the growing realization of just how dangerous this information was. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about survival. David clicked through the files, scanning them quickly. Here, he said, pointing at a document labeled Operation Phoenix. This is it. This is what they've been planning. Elena leaned closer, reading the contents. The file detailed a covert operation, spanning years, designed to manipulate global events, starting with media coverage and extending into the highest levels of government. Operation Phoenix, she whispered. They were orchestrating everything: wars, elections, media narratives. David's face was grim. This is the heart of their power. If we expose this, it'll bring them down. Elena's fingers tightened on the back of the chair. How do we get this out? How do we make sure they can't stop us? David's eyes flickered to the window, the dark night beyond. We need to get this to the right people. People who can help us. But it won't be easy. Elena felt a knot tighten in her stomach. No one will believe us, she said, her voice hollow. This is too big. They'll bury it. They'll bury us first. David's face softened, his eyes meeting hers. We can't let that happen. We can't just sit here and wait for them to find us. We need to act now. Before Elena could respond, a sudden noise broke the silence. A faint scraping sound, like footsteps in the hall. David's eyes snapped to the door. They've found us. Elena's breath hitched. No. The sound grew louder, closer. The unmistakable echo of boots on concrete. David grabbed her arm. We're not safe here. Not anymore. He jumped up, slamming the laptop closed. Where do we go? Elena whispered, panic rising in her chest. David didn't answer immediately. His mind was already racing, thinking ahead. Then his eyes landed on the window, and an idea seemed to form. We're going out the back, he said quickly. We need to move fast. Before Elena could protest, David was already at the window, prying it open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Climb out, David urged, glancing over his shoulder. Now, Elena hesitated for only a second before moving toward the window. She had no choice. There was no time to argue. The moment her feet hit the ground outside, she heard the door to the room crash open behind her. Footsteps, no longer distant. Too close. Go, David shouted, pulling her down an alley and into the shadowed streets. They ran, ducking into the maze of narrow, twisting alleys that wound through the city. Elena's heart was pounding in her ears, her legs aching, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. David led her down an alley, then took a sharp turn, nearly knocking her off balance. She caught a glimpse of his face, determined, but desperate. There's a contact, he said, breathing heavily. Someone who can help us get this information out. Elena didn't question him. They kept running, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter, but never completely fading. Where are they? She asked breathlessly. Just ahead, David said. A safe place, but we've got to hurry. They reached another street, this one wider and more populated. David kept his pace, his eyes scanning the crowd for anything suspicious. They couldn't be seen. If they were, it would all be over. They passed through the crowd, trying to blend in, but Elena felt her nerves on edge, every muscle tensed. Then ahead she saw him, a man in a dark coat, standing by the door of a small cafe. Her heart skipped. David nodded toward him. That's our contact. Stay close. They made their way toward the cafe, but just as they neared the door, Elena heard the unmistakable sound of a car skidding to a halt behind them. David turned to her, his expression darkening. "Move," he shouted. They ran for the door, and just as they reached it, a shadow appeared behind them, a figure emerging from the darkness. A man, a gun in his hand. "Stop right there," he shouted. David shoved Elena through the door, slamming it shut behind them. The man fired once. The bullet ricocheted off the door, and Elena felt the world blur around her. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Inside, they were safe for now. But the fight was far from over. The door slammed shut with a heavy thud, echoing through the small cafe. Elena's chest heaved as she stumbled inside, her eyes wild with fear. David grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back of the cafe, away from the windows and the door where the gunshot had come from. The cafe was dim, with only a few scattered patrons, but everything felt wrong, as though they were being watched. David's grip tightened, urgency in his every movement. "This way," he muttered, leading her through the narrow corridor that led to a back door. The man outside, the one with the gun, had to have heard them. They didn't have much time. Elena felt her heart pounding in her throat, her body shaking with adrenaline and fear. They rounded a corner into a small storage room, hidden away from view. David quickly bolted the door behind them and turned to face her. She opened her mouth to ask what they were going to do next, but before she could, the sound of the gunshot still reverberated in her mind. "Who was that?" she whispered. David's eyes flickered with unease. "He's one of them. One of the collective's men. We were too late." Her stomach twisted. "Too late for what?" she breathed. David's face was drawn, his jaw clenched. "They've got someone inside the cafe. Someone who's already tipped them off." She stared at him, trying to process his words. "If they know we're here, we can't stay in the city much longer." David was already moving again, his mind working through the next steps. "I have a contact, someone who can help us escape the city, but we need to act fast. They'll be here soon." The urgency in his voice drove a cold spike of fear through Elena. She wanted to argue, to question everything, but she couldn't, not with time running out. "Where's this contact?" she asked, trying to steady her breath. David pulled out a phone, quickly texting something. "They'll be waiting near the docks. It's our best chance." He looked at her, eyes sharp. "Stay close and don't make a sound. We leave now." Elena barely had time to react before David was already leading her toward the back door. He cracked it open, checking the alley for any movement. It was silent, too silent. They slipped outside, into the shadows of the street. David's hand was firm on her wrist, guiding her through the darkened alleyways, their footsteps muffled by the damp pavement. Elena's heart raced. Every corner, every alley felt like a trap. Every sound in the distance made her freeze. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They reached the outskirts of the city, the skyline disappearing behind them as they neared the docks. The faint smell of salt water and decay hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, controlled environment they'd just escaped. David led her down a narrow path toward a row of old shipping containers, their steel sides dark and rusted. "Almost there," he murmured, his voice tense. Elena looked around, the shadows creeping around them. "Where's your contact?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David stopped at the end of the path and looked out into the night. He didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the area with an intensity that made Elena's skin crawl. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man dressed in black, with a cap pulled low over his face. He approached quickly, but his movements were cautious. "Elena," David said, his voice firm. "This is Tomas. He's the one who can help us get out." Tomas nodded curtly, his gaze flicking to Elena for a moment before turning back to David. "We don't have much time. I have a boat waiting, but it's risky. We'll need to move fast." David nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We're ready." Tomas led them toward a small, weathered boat that was docked further down the pier. Elena's gaze swept the area again, but there was no sign of pursuit. Yet, she could hear the soft slap of water against the hull of the boat as Tomas guided them on board. David stepped in first, then turned to help Elena, his grip steady as he pulled her up beside him. The engine roared to life, the sound reverberating through the night. Elena looked over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the docks one last time. No sign of anyone, but she knew it wouldn't last. "Let's go," Tomas said sharply, pulling the boat away from the dock. They were moving now, the boat cutting through the water, the lights of the city fading behind them. Elena's breath slowed, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. They were in the open now, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the collective wasn't done with them. Not by a long shot. But for the first time, Elena felt a small flicker of hope. They were alive. And as long as they were alive, there was still a chance to stop the collective. The boat cut through the cold, black water, the gentle hum of the engine filling the silence between them. Elena leaned back against the cool metal of the boat's side, her eyes staring out into the void of the night, trying to steady her racing heart. The city was behind them now, but the fear still gnawed at her. The collective had already proven how far they were willing to go. The darkness ahead felt just as suffocating, like a void pulling them in, threatening to swallow them whole. She glanced at David, his face illuminated only by the dim glow of the boat's engine. He seemed calm, too calm, but his eyes were shadowed with worry. "Elena," Tomas said, breaking the quiet. His voice was low but firm. "We need to move quickly. We're not far from the safe house, but we'll be exposed once we reach open waters. They've likely already mobilized." Elena nodded, her throat dry. "How do you know we're safe?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know they won't find us?" Tomas glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "Because we've planned for this," he said, "but we have to stay ahead of them. They won't stop hunting you, not now." David's jaw tightened. "We need a plan. A real one." Tomas's eyes flickered toward him, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Once we're clear of the city, we head to the safe house. It's remote, well hidden. We'll lay low there for a while, but you'll need to get ready." "Ready for what?" Elena asked, her stomach dropping. "You'll have to go underground. It's the only way to keep them from tracking you." Tomas's voice was firm, but there was a faint edge of sympathy. "The people who want you gone, they'll stop at nothing, and they've already shown they're willing to do whatever it takes to erase you." Elena felt the weight of his words like a stone in her chest. "They won't stop, will they?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on the waves slapping against the boat. "No," Tomas replied, his voice cold. "They'll keep coming until you're either dead or silenced." David leaned forward, his face hardening as he looked out over the water. "They can't get away with this. Not if we expose them. Not if we—" But his words trailed off as though he, too, realized just how fragile their situation was. Tomas steered the boat with practiced ease, his eyes scanning the horizon. "How far?" David asked, breaking the silence. "Not far," Tomas answered, his voice tight with urgency. "Maybe an hour, if we're lucky. But once we're out there, we need to move fast." Elena's mind was reeling, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The file, the collective, David's role in all of this. She had so many questions, but there was no time to ask them now. Every second that passed brought them closer to their unknown fate. She couldn't help but feel the gnawing sense of dread that had been with her ever since she first started investigating David's disappearance. The closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous everything became. And now, standing on this boat, with the cold night air stinging her skin, she realized that the truth was far worse than anything she had ever imagined. The collective wasn't just an organization. It was a shadow that had infected everything. She was a part of something much larger than she had ever expected. And as they sped toward the unknown, Elena knew that there would be no easy escape. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the boat, and she forced herself to focus on what was ahead. The truth had to come out. She had to make it happen, no matter the cost. A sudden flash of light cut through the darkness ahead. Headlights. Elena's breath caught. "David," Tomas hissed. "We've been spotted." The boat jerked to the side, Tomas veering sharply to the left, his face pale with determination. "Hold on," he barked, pushing the throttle. "We need to lose them." David grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her down as the boat veered wildly, sending them both crashing against the sides. The sound of an engine revving loudly filled the air. Another boat, chasing them. Elena's heart raced as Tomas swerved again, the boat lifting over the waves, narrowly avoiding the other vessel. She could hear the distant voices from the pursuing boat, shouting her name. Her blood ran cold. "They know we're here," Tomas muttered under his breath. "We need to shake them off now." But Elena knew that wasn't going to be easy. As the boat sped forward, she could see the other vessel drawing closer. Her eyes flickered to David, his face set in grim determination. "This can't be happening," she breathed. David turned to her, his eyes sharp. "It's happening. Now stay low and don't make a sound." The boat surged forward again, Tomas pushing the throttle to the limit. The sound of the engines behind them grew louder, closer. They were gaining, and Elena knew this wasn't just a chase anymore. This was their last chance to survive. The boat lurched forward again, slamming into the waves with brutal force, nearly throwing Elena off balance. Her heart hammered in her chest as the sound of the pursuing boat grew louder, closer, like a predator closing in on its prey. Elena's hand gripped the side of the boat, her knuckles white. Tomas's face was set in fierce concentration, his eyes scanning the water ahead, looking for any possible way to evade the other vessel. "They're gaining," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena didn't answer. She couldn't. Her thoughts were jumbled, frantic, the only clear one being that they couldn't afford to stop. The boat jolted again, and for a split second, Elena thought she saw the lights of the other boat flash across the waves beside them. They were so close. Tomas cursed under his breath, throwing a glance over his shoulder. "Hold on," he shouted, throwing the wheel hard to the right. The boat veered off course, slicing through the waves at an angle, sending a spray of salt water flying into the air. Elena felt her body jerk with the sudden change in direction. She clenched her teeth, her eyes scanning the dark water, but all she could see was the blur of the pursuing boat. The other engine roared, the sound cutting through the night like a sharp blade. They weren't backing off. "We can't outrun them," Tomas said, his voice strained. "We need to lose them in the fog. Head north, toward the cliffs. We'll have a better chance of disappearing into the mist." David didn't hesitate. "Do it," he said. Tomas yanked the throttle, pushing the boat faster, the speed making Elena's stomach drop. The fog was starting to roll in, a thick, impenetrable layer of mist that seemed to form out of nowhere. Elena's eyes widened. It was their chance. She could barely see the water in front of them now, but she could hear the pursuing boat just behind them. The sounds of their engine, their shouting, it was all closing in. Tomas's hands were steady on the controls, guiding them toward the cliffs, the fog thickening, swallowing the world around them. Elena could feel her breath catch in her throat. "Almost there," Tomas said. "Stay low." The fog felt like a veil, a strange sense of protection and danger all at once. And just when Elena thought they might escape, she heard it, the unmistakable crack of gunfire. The bullet whizzed past them, the sound sharp, cutting through the air. Tomas jerked the wheel hard to the left, the boat veering dangerously close to the rocks. "Elena!" David shouted, grabbing her arm. Hold on. The boat sped toward the cliffs, the engine roaring louder than ever as they raced through the fog. The air was thick now, the mist swirling around them, blurring their surroundings. Then, just as the cliffside loomed before them, Tomas pulled the boat hard to the right, steering them into a narrow channel. They were in a small inlet, hidden by the jagged rocks that framed the entrance. Elena could barely make out the water ahead, but the sound of the other boat's engine was still there, far behind them now. They had to be close. Tomas slowed the boat, easing it into the shadows of the cliffs, and cut the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could hear the thudding of her own heartbeat in her ears. For a long moment, no one spoke. The fog hung thick around them, muffling everything. David slowly turned to Tomas, his voice low. "Do you think they saw us?" Tomas stared out into the mist, his face unreadable. "I don't know," he said, "but they won't stop looking." Elena's chest tightened. "Then what now?" she asked, her voice shaky. Tomas turned to face her, his eyes flicking to the cliffs, then to the water. "We wait." Elena stared at him. "Wait. For how long?" He didn't answer immediately. "We'll wait until the fog clears," Tomas said, "and then we'll head out. Keep moving. You're not safe yet." David leaned back against the boat's side, his face shadowed. Elena could see the exhaustion in his eyes, but there was something else too, determination. They weren't giving up. Not now. "We're not safe anywhere," David muttered, his voice low. "But we'll keep running. We'll find a way to get this information out." Tomas looked at him, his lips tightening into a thin line. "The problem is, the more we move, the more exposed we become," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena shivered, but Tomas's eyes softened. "Listen to me," he said. "If you want to survive, if you want this to end, you need to disappear. You need to become a ghost." David looked at him, then at Elena. The weight of the decision hung between them. A part of Elena wanted to resist, to fight, but deep down, she knew Tomas was right. If they didn't vanish now, they would never get the chance. The fog thickened, and in the shadows they waited, caught in a dangerous limbo where the past was chasing them, and the future was uncertain. The boat rocked gently in the thickening mist, its quiet creak the only sound that filled the heavy silence. Elena's eyes scanned the water, the darkness stretching endlessly before them, offering no answers, only uncertainty. David was leaning against the side, his jaw clenched, eyes focused on the nothingness ahead. His silence was unsettling. She could feel the weight of his thoughts, the pressure of the decision that lay ahead. "We can't stay here long," Tomas said, breaking the quiet. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "If they're still out there, they'll be combing the area by now. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be to slip away unnoticed." Elena nodded, her throat tight. "Then what do we do?" Tomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared out into the fog, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something just beyond reach. Finally, he turned back to them. "I know a place," he said, his tone even. "A cabin in the hills, isolated, off the grid. They won't find you there." "I know a place," he said, his tone even. "A cabin in the hills, isolated, off the grid. They won't find you there." David shifted, sitting upright. "And how do you know they won't?" Tomas looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Because I've been there before. It's off the radar. And it's the only place I trust." Elena swallowed. The idea of moving again so soon unsettled her. But she understood. They had no other choice. The longer they stayed in one place, the more vulnerable they became. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's go." Tomas turned the boat's engine back on, the low hum of it cutting through the stillness. The mist seemed to close in tighter around them as they pushed through the water, the world shrinking to just the boat and the unrelenting fog. Minutes stretched on, every second feeling like an eternity. Elena's mind raced, her thoughts tangled in a web of uncertainty. They were running, yes, but what exactly were they running toward? The cabin, a safe haven, or a trap? She glanced at David, his eyes distant, lost in thought. For the first time, she wondered if he was second-guessing their choices, too. If he was even sure anymore what they were trying to accomplish. She opened her mouth to speak, but Tomas's voice interrupted her. "Stay sharp," he said. "We're getting close." Elena stiffened, her pulse quickening. How close? The boat slowed, and Tomas steered them carefully through the mist, navigating by instinct, by some knowledge of the waters that Elena didn't have. The silence grew thick again, every creak of the boat sounding louder in the dense fog. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the boat jerked forward as Tomas revved the engine, pulling them into a narrow inlet between jagged rocks. Elena's stomach dropped as they entered a small cove, hidden from view, the cliffs rising sharply on either side. "Here," Tomas said, cutting the engine once more. The boat glided silently into a small, rocky shore. Tomas quickly jumped out, his boots splashing in the shallows as he steadied the boat. David followed, offering a hand to Elena. She took it, her fingers cold, her mind still racing. They stepped onto the rocky shore, the smell of damp earth and salt water in the air. The cabin Tomas spoke of was just ahead, partially obscured by trees and thick brush, as though it had been waiting in this forgotten corner of the world. The fog hung in the air, thick and suffocating, adding to the eerie silence of the place. Tomas led the way, moving quickly, his every step deliberate, as though he were expecting someone to be following them. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, and her breath felt shallow. She looked over her shoulder, but all she could see was the impenetrable fog. Inside, Tomas ordered, his voice low. "Now." They hurried inside the cabin, the door creaking on its hinges as Tomas pushed it open. The interior was dark, but there was a faint smell of wood and something old, something untouched. A small fireplace sat in the corner, cold and unlit, and the furniture was sparse, worn from years of neglect. Tomas didn't waste any time. He immediately locked the door behind them and moved to the window, peering out cautiously through the blinds. David turned to Elena, his eyes hard, determined. "This won't be enough," he said. "We're sitting ducks here, Tomas. They'll find us." Tomas remained silent for a moment before turning to face them. "I know it's not perfect, but it's the best we have right now, and it's the only place they won't expect you to go." Elena sank down into one of the chairs, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. She could feel her limbs trembling, the tension in her body releasing for the first time in hours. "Do you trust him?" she asked quietly, looking at David. David didn't answer right away. His gaze was distant, as though he were weighing something in his mind. Finally, he met her eyes. "I trust him enough to get us here, but that doesn't mean we're safe." A shiver ran down Elena's spine. The weight of David's words settled over her like a heavy fog. "We need to keep moving," he said. "We need to get this information out. We need to make sure it doesn't die here." Tomas turned to them then, his expression serious. "You need to understand something. This doesn't end here. You'll be hunted every step of the way. They won't stop, not until they get what they want." Elena looked up at him, her throat tight. "What if we can't get it out? Then everything we've done, everything we've risked, was for nothing." David moved toward the window, looking out into the fog, his face unreadable. Elena stood up slowly, her resolve hardening. Tomas was right. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about exposing the collective, about forcing the world to see the truth. She wasn't going to let it end here. No matter what it cost, the silence in the cabin was oppressive. Elena stood by the window, her eyes scanning the thick fog outside. Every minute stretched on like an eternity. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just about getting away anymore. It was about ending the chase, ending the collective stranglehold once and for all. David was pacing near the fireplace, his face tight, lost in thought. Tomas stood by the door, watching them both with a quiet intensity. Elena could see the weariness in his eyes, the same exhaustion that mirrored her own. "How long are we staying here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile calm around them. Tomas glanced over at her. "We can't stay here forever, but we need to make our next move count." David stopped pacing and turned toward him. "What do you suggest?" Tomas stepped toward the table, pulling out a map, one that looked old and worn from years of use. He laid it out carefully, his fingers tracing a route along its surface. "There's a town to the northeast. Small. Off the radar. If we can get there, we can contact someone who can help us get this information out. But we'll need to move fast. And we'll need to be careful." Elena swallowed. "How do we know we can trust them?" Tomas's eyes flickered, but his expression remained calm. "We don't. But it's our only shot." David looked at Elena, his eyes dark with uncertainty. "If we go there, there's no turning back." She met his gaze, her heart heavy but resolute. "I know." A loud knock on the cabin door shattered the silence. It echoed through the small space, sharp and jarring. Elena froze. David was already moving toward the door, his hand reaching for something on the shelf behind him. Tomas's face went pale. "Don't open it," he hissed. But the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "We know you're in there, and we've got nowhere else to go." David's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. David's hand froze just inches from the door. Elena's heart skipped a beat. The voice on the other side was too familiar, too cold. It wasn't someone they could trust. It wasn't someone who had come to help. "We know you're in there, and we've got nowhere else to go." The voice on the other side was low, a mixture of command and desperation. David hesitated for just a second, his fingers tightening around the doorframe. Then, without a word, he turned to Tomas. "We can't let them in," Tomas said, his voice sharp, urgent. "They'll lead the collective straight to us." Elena's mind raced. Every instinct told her that opening that door was a mistake. But then again, closing it might be an even bigger one. There's no way out of this. Not without a choice. "Who are they?" she whispered to David, barely trusting her own voice. David's face hardened. "People I used to trust. People who might still be useful. But if they've been compromised, they'll turn us in the second we let them through that door." The knock came again, this time harder. The door creaked under the pressure. "We don't have time," David said, his voice hoarse. "We need to make a decision. Now." Elena felt her chest tighten. In the darkness, every decision had consequences. Every move they made felt like it could be their last. They could keep running, but would it ever stop? Would they ever be free? Tomas looked at them both, his expression grim. "If we stay here, we're just buying time. We can't afford that. Not anymore." David nodded slowly, his jaw set. "Then we leave. We fight our way out." A silence fell over the cabin. The weight of their decision hung in the air, but something within Elena clicked. The truth, no matter how dangerous, had to come out. The collective would never stop unless they exposed everything. And if that meant taking a stand now, then so be it. "Open the door," Elena said, her voice steady, though her insides were a storm. David turned, looking at her, eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. With a deep breath, he unlocked the door. The final choice was made. As it creaked open, Elena saw the faces of those on the other side. Betrayal was written in their eyes, but something else lingered there, too, a fear that mirrored her own. A fear of the collective. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't the only ones trapped in this war. The door closed behind them all, the final step taken. It was over. For now.